Understanding the problem of Socrates, of the philosophical life. Raphael Sanzio, the Renaissance painter, helps us understand this problem. Let us consider two paintings by Raphael, the notorious School of Athens and the Transfiguration of the Christ. By considering central aspects of these paintings, we will come closer than usual to appreciating the problem of Socrates and its essential relationship with the Christian religion. But a preface here is called for we live in a modern world, and we're raised as moderns, as Machiavellians, as Cartesians. These terms may not mean anything to us in our ears. We might be identifying Descartes, for example, René Descartes, with one historical figure. We might not be familiar with him at all. We might have never heard his name, and yet we would have been raised in a Cartesian manner. We are going to Cartesian schools, living in a Cartesian world. We're being entertained by Cartesian art, rhetoric, music. What does this mean? How could this be preventing us from appreciating the philosophical life? The answer to this lies in the modern revolution, the kernel of that revolution. Let us call that revolution the Cartesian revolution, although Descartes was not the primary source of this revolution or instigator or conspirator. Anyway, Descartes, what is he teaching? He's teaching us that in order to best appreciate the world, reality, we should begin with a clean slate from the Cartesian ego. I am. This is the fundamental datum. I am. Of course, in classical terms, I am was, well, God's definition, right? I am what I am in the Platonic sense. Outside of the Platonic circle, we might say, I shall be what I shall be. In other words, the future, destiny, belongs to me, and I am mysterious, and you cannot grasp me. You cannot reduce me to the plane of ordinary being. Determinations. But in a Platonic sense, being is eternal. And so what Plato is saying is that God is open to our understanding and opens up our understanding to God. This is what is meant primarily by the expression fides querens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. In the Middle Ages, we have this formalization of the principle that is subverted by our Cartesian understanding. Subverted for us. We're no longer capable of understanding that. When we hear faith, we assume, well, you believe in a credo, in a formula, in words. We don't want to be stuck with this legalistic understanding of reality. We want to go beyond it. And so we follow Descartes with this straw man in mind. We assume that faith is just an obstacle to freedom. Here's the problem. We do not seek truth at the heart of faith. But now, what is faith in the classical sense? It is trust. What is the primary form of trust for the human being? Trust in the authority of the parent, which is first and foremost the father. With respect to authority, he is the, shall we say, the incarnation of the primary incarnation of authority. So when Socrates speaks, he speaks in the classical world where the primary figure of authority is, of course, the father. Right? He represents the law. And you say, well, but that is, we can go back further to a matriarchal society. Well, one thing is that the notion of matriarchy is somewhat modern. At the very least, it is conceived in antagonism with patriarchy. But if we want to speak about ancient matriarchy, so in other words, some tribal societies where you have the sorceress, right, who is revered, and we see this, of course, in Diotima, in Plato's Symposium, and elsewhere, we find, of course, the woman is the muse, the wisdom, Sophia, right, is a woman. Oh, yes, even in patriarchy. Well, if we go to that society, the matriarchal tribal society, which isn't that free, by the way, what we have is an openness to patriarchy. We don't have a shift into patriarchy for nothing. It's not some kind of a mechanical imposition that we have. All on a sudden, we went from matriarchy to patriarchy. Evil Jove, evil Jupiter, Zeus. Get rid of him, and we'll end up with what? And the Greeks warned us, a bacchanal. We'll end up with the bacchantes. Wild women going around, ripping each other's hair maybe, I don't know, taking drugs, going wild, and killing men. Let us close this parenthesis. Focus on the central issue here, the issue of faith as trust in your Father's word. How can you trust in your Father's word when your father's an alcoholic? Socrates arises as a problem in the face of a kind of crisis, certainly not the crisis we have today on a global scale, crisis of standards. Nevertheless, somewhat of a crisis. The ground of the crisis was still not yet invoked as being part of the crisis. So there was the possibility for Socrates to appeal to Homer, to the truth about Homer. We can't do that today. We're not allowed to officially, because the very ground of our crisis is crisis. That's the whole modern revolution. But again, faith. What is faith all about? It is about trusting your Father's word. Why would you want to trust your Father's word? Well, what else do you have? We live in a world with limitations. In Christian terms, in a fallen world. A world fallen into confusion and darkness. There's evil. There's horrible things going on. Whom do we trust? If not the Father. Now, if we're not lucky, well, tough luck. Maybe our father is an alcoholic. But then again, if he is, probably the society he's living in is pretty bad. Maybe he's just reflecting in his, debauchery. He's reflecting the sins of the society. At any rate, where do we go if not to our Father? Social services, a machine. The Leviathan. The classics say, look, our best bet is to go to your Father. De Lampedusa, in the 20th century, wrote a book the leopard, il gatto pardo, where he spells this problem out in glaring terms. He says, well, there's a shift into the modern world. That is a shift from lions to hyenas and shackles. What does he mean? It means that in the pre-modern world, what holds society together is a bond, a blood bond, an allegiance, a close society. In the modern world, the allegiance is economic. Mercenaries who are there to take advantage of you. So, whom are you going to trust? Now, there is a shortcoming in Lampedusa's work, which is to say that there is no real vindication of the classical position. But the classics do vindicate that position by indicating that there is something irreducible in that classical bond. The blood is not simply blood. There is something hidden in the blood, and that is spirit, and this is at the heart of the Christian message. So, this in mind, right? Keeping this in mind, let us consider Raphael. Raphael's School of Athens offers us an image of Socrates and of Plato. Now, if we consider these two figures in their distinct context, the peculiar context, we will see an obvious difference. First of all, Socrates. He never wrote anything. He speaks to people, mostly non-philosophers. In fact, pretty much non-philosophers. They could be soldiers, they could be young people, anybody from the street, but he knows them. He somewhat trusts them. He sees that they're not altogether evil. They're not there to attack him. Not really. They're not slandering him. They're not a threat to his life. So he's not really speaking under compulsion, much compulsion. He is pretty frank, but he is not going to be speaking to them as if they were philosophers in philosophical terms. So in the painting by Raphael, you see Socrates exposing things 1, 2, 3, as if he were speaking to children, which is perfectly fine. He's not condescending, he's among them. He's among the people. And this is the word of Socrates. And Socrates is his word. It's a living word, spoken directly. In comes Plato. But Plato represents here writing, communication and writing. Of course, Plato warns us about the dangers of writing. Right? He tells us that his letter, for instance, he tells us in some dialogues, he tells us that writing invites all kinds of problems, right? Difficulties. You don't know who is reading. Could be an evil person who hates you, wants to destroy you, wants to deny all authority. Right? What is Socrates up to when he speaks to these people? Well, he's telling them, look, the philosophical life is meaningful. How could it be meaningful? Well, yes, because being is intelligible. Because the statesman is, the carpenter is, all that is has a reason of being. There's a form within, in Platonic terms, something that we can understand. There's a problem that is open to our understanding that allows us to understand too. Otherwise, philosophy would be pointless. When Socrates asks about, well, what the God meant, whether God was right or wrong, and so forth. He is essentially telling us that the God must make sense. If you were assuming that the God was absurd, that there's no ground to inquiry, there's no ground of intelligibility to his investigation, then what's the point? His investigation presupposed that the ground is intelligible. And in Platonic terms, you said, well, Plato comes up and said, well, that means that the form that is apparent presupposes a form that is fully intelligible. And so there's a realm of forms. The world of appearances presupposes a reality. A reality, its own reality. The fullness of what is apparent is fully intelligible. And that's why we can philosophize. But Plato is very careful when he says this. He says this still in the form of dialogues. What does he do in the form of dialogues? He posits eternal forms that cannot be reduced to things that we use, things that we make use of to apply them to solve our problems. In other words, to enter into a world in which all problems are solvable. That is a technical world. The Tower of Babel, in classical biblical terms. So Plato is giving us an antidote, right, against this temptation to leap into this arena where we might be tempted to build a Tower of Babel. Again, a world in which all problems are technical. A world in which truth itself becomes a means to power. Right? And this is what we have today. As soon as the Platonic ideas become concepts with Descartes and company, then concepts are useful. Can be used to build a new world. On what foundation? Merely formulaic, geometrical, right? A scheme, terms, formulas. Right? These formulas we have. Immanuel Kant. Right? We have formulas of words, and they can be used to establish a kingdom of ends. Now, what about Plato? He says, well, we have these formulas. They cannot be reached by experience. They cannot be grasped. They remain mysterious. They are the foundation of our experience. But he says this in the context of a dialogue. So he replicates somehow Socratic speech, living speech, in writing. Writing is fixed, right, formulaic, and yet he opens it up to speech. However, with Plato, a further difficulty arises, anticipated by Plato himself, of course. Once you establish these forms, once you say, well, there is something that is immutable, then of course you have opened up a can of worms, right? What is it that connects the mutable to the immutable? The third in the middle. Well, you say dialogue, but dialogue is exposed to interpretation, obviously, thank God. But here you have a lot of debates. What does he really mean? Does he mean that we should abandon, finally? Socrates was on the way to abandoning common sense and leap into the world of pure science, which is what we're told to do today by today's scientists. I was recently listening to Etienne Klein, some Frenchman, scientist, physicist, right? Physicist who says, well, people are complaining, discrediting modern science. But modern science from the beginning has been against common sense. People are going back to common sense. That's ridiculous. Modern science shows that modern common sense is just faulty. It's not reliable. We have to break through, overcome, debunk common sense. On what grounds? On purely scientific formulaic terms. All right. So some in the ancient world have thought about going that way. Plato, of course, forewarns us. He says, well, no, that is not a good way to go. And yet, we have that sort of formulaic reading of Plato. So Aristotle comes into play here. And he says, well, you know what? I'm going to have to address this issue. I can't do it in the dialogical way, as in the dialogue form, because that'll still expose me, to these objections, and they'll be able to read me as they read Plato. So what can I do? I have to be strict about it. I have to be scientific about returning to the Socratic problem. So I'm going to come up with a formula for what is in the middle between the physical, to say, and the purely intelligible. And he comes up with formulations that have to do with intelligeia. It has to do with the inherence of the end in the means. So he says there's a mysterious inherence of an actuality in all potentiality. There is no such thing as a pure possibility. You say, well, it means whatever I feel like it means. No. All possibility is a potentiality, and all potentiality presupposes an actuality. What do you mean? It means that if I look at an acorn, there is the oak tree within it. It's meant for that. Well, what about the acorns that don't develop? Too bad. But it's meant for that. It has the capacity to become an acorn, to become an oak tree. So what about a baby? He has a capacity of becoming a man, or a woman, of course. Capacity. Well, but he's going to be killed. Too bad. But he has the capacity of becoming not only any old man, but a great man. Oh. What is a man? A great man. And so he speaks about the man of virtue, who ultimately lives in the light of absolute truth. And so, thought that is the pure actuality of the universe. So, in Raphael, you have not one representative of books, of writing, but two. And the harmony of the two is marked in various ways, but you could see it as defined by a curb. And the curb moves from Aristotle and it moves on to the shoulders of Plato. So Aristotle's lower, Plato's further up. And of course, Plato points to Socrates. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Right? Curb down to Socrates. Socrates is the problem. Now, Aristotle, does he solve the problem? No, of course not. After Aristotle, we have, well, notoriously confusion in the schools. We have reached a level of abstraction now in writing that begs for a return to the Socratic life. So we have eventually the establishment of the Stoic school, which tries to recover, in the light of Plato and Aristotle, tries to recover Socrates. But that is still not enough. Why? Because the Socratic life at this point has been exposed to the general public. What this means is that you need to justify the Socratic life in the face of all evil detractors, people who hated Socrates. Of course, we can love Socrates today because Socrates means nothing. We love the name. We love whatever we feel like saying about him, whatever we might believe he was or he represented. Everything means nothing and everything at the same time today, because we live in nominalist times. But let us close this parenthesis. Digression aside, there is an attempt to return to Socrates with the Stoics, but it's not enough, because that attempt is simply purely tied to a school of philosophy. Socrates, let us never forget, Socrates was speaking to non-philosophers. The Stoics are now incapable of speaking to non-philosophers. So they go to the emperor, and they try to convert him. Say, well, maybe you can help convert the whole country to philosophy in some way or another. In other words, not to the philosophical life per se, but at least help people, the country, the nation, the empire, accept philosophy as a way of life. Remember that possibility. Once you remember the possibility, and in other words, once you have this dream of philosophy, then somebody, might figure out what the dream refers to. Or at any rate, there is somewhere to go when you're trying to defend the philosophical life. The legitimacy of a life dedicated to a truth that transcends all norms. Truth, not my truth, the truth. The absolute truth. So, what do? We need more than what the Stoics had to offer. The Stoics saw well that they couldn't handle things on their own. They needed an emperor. The problem was that their emperor was very faulty. And at some point, it becomes so obvious that worldly emperors are not nearly enough. So, in the emperor, who was supposed to be let's say, potentially the philosopher king, right? You do not have an adequate foundation for the justification of the philosophical life. We see now why it is important to have Christianity. Not because it's merely useful, but because with Christianity, and here comes Raphael's transfiguration of the Christ, we have a consummate defense of a philosophical life. Now, consider Socrates, people looking at him. Oh, they're listening as children. Now consider the audience for Aristotle and Plato. Ooh, impressed. At a distance. They're in the center. Writing is in the center of debates. Ooh, look at that word. Look at that text. Look at that formula. Timaeus. The ethics. They're holding books. But they're just words. Socrates will come to represent a body, living body. Aristotle and Plato, books, words that are separated from the living body. And now we need to reconcile the two. We need a living word, a truly eternal living word. Not a mortal one, an eternal one. And this word is King. This is what the Christ represents. The living, eternal word that is within the body, within the flesh, the incarnated word, the word incarnate. And what is this all about? It says, well, Socrates is fully grounded. The philosophical life is rooted in a mysterious actuality. Philosophical logos is rooted in divine logos. This is a truth. It's not an historical invention, machination, something cunning, the fruit of cunning among scholars. No. They're testifying to the irreducibility of the Socratic life to its context, the audience. Accordingly, with Raphael, you have a transfiguration of the Christ. Consider the audience. The people are either blinded, they're frightened. Oh my God, how can blood be in wine? How can the Spirit inhere in darkness as light? How can darkness be illuminated by the light from within? So this is the great message of Christianity, but it is also a message that we find at the heart of the philosophical life as represented by Socrates and in writing Plato and Aristotle. Of course, Plato and Aristotle were speaking to other people, right? But not to non-philosophers. They had schools that were entrenched, that were defended, protected, right? They had castles of nobility, nobile castello, as Dante would call it. In other words, they spoke to the outside world, the world of non-philosophers, only in writing. Right? Because they had reached a point where it was no longer practical to speak to the outside world because you had so many evil people who were led astray by so-called sophists into radical suspicion toward the philosophical life. Imagine. Reason presupposing divinity? Are you out of your mind? Of course, we're raised today as moderns to assume that that's absurd. That the philosophical life is rooted in radical skepticism, freeing ourselves from all authority. That's not Plato, that's not Aristotle, that's not Socrates, and obviously, as Christianity confirms, that's not the Middle Ages. It is the modern world. However, with the modern world, you don't get rid of authority, you replace one authority with the other. So you replace, let us go back to Lampedusa, you replace the authority that is natural with an authority that is simply artful, technical, that of merchants, the logic of merchants, a mercenary authority, a nominalist authority that is imposed on us as a machine. So the upshot of this is what modernity is all about, ultimately, is the replacement of a natural authority with a completely artificial authority. And this is what we have with technocracy today. And this is also why the problem of Socrates comes back to us in response to our contemporary crisis. It is not simply a crisis of opinions, it is a crisis that involves radical alienation from the ground of discourse. We have been raised to reject viscerally the notion that human knowledge or science, scientia, episteme, is grounded in divine intelligence. This would mean that it is not mechanistic. This would mean that Descartes was fundamentally wrong about departing from the classics to make up clean slate, tabula rasa, a new reason that is essentially mechanistic. It can be applied everywhere, just as his method can be applied everywhere, to establish a new science, right? And a new scientific world. He would be lying to us in the respect that he would be pretending that this is what reason has always been about, right? This is what philosophy is all about. No. if you study Plato, if you study Aristotle, Cicero, Aquinas, the writers of 2,000 years of literature, right? You find out that philosophy is not grounded in this ego, the Cartesian ego, who says, I am, ego sum. And this is the foundation of all thought, investigation. Right? Ego cogito, cogito, I think. Therefore I am. In other words, my being is right there. The thought now becomes the proof of my being. How could I be thinking if I were not? My being is the foundation of thought. My thought presupposes necessarily my own being. This is not Socrates. This is not Plato. This is not Aristotle. This is an anti-Platonic position that goes back to some extent, reformulates, radicalizes nominalist intuitions from arguments from the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages. But this is what we're raised with, and that's why it is so difficult for us to accept that Socrates was not a Cartesian, that his life was incompatible with our own, and that in order to return to the problem of Socrates, the Socratic life as a problem, we would need to question our own new upbringing. Not, again, that would be pointless, in a Cartesian way. In other words, by saying, oh, let's have another tabula rasa. Right? Let's get rid of all reason, both ancient and modern, and the ancient through the modern. Once you get rid of modern reason, hey, ancient reason had already been eliminated with it, right? No, we don't need to go back to a tabula rasa. So what could we do? Should we say, well, we are the products, this is the usual alternative, we are the products of our environment. So let's go back to non-philosophy, and let's have a thorough critique of philosophy based on non-philosophy. This is the destruction of all reason. So we end up with technocracy again. What is the alternative? The alternative remains a Socratic life, but as long as we do not recover the principle of fides querens intellectum, of a trust in the authority of the Father, what does this mean? It means two things. One, that what the Father's telling me, what my Father's telling me, has a reason. Two, that very reason enables me, Son, to rise unto it, to return to it. That very reason is working within me as I hear my Father's word. Not only is there God, but God is such that he discloses a path for me, enables me to rise back to him. This is a fundamental principle of the classical world that we have abandoned today. Compliments of Monsieur Descartes.